welcome to the Baker Institute. I'm glad that you could join us this afternoon. We're honored to have Secretary Ben Carson with us. We're looking forward to an informative discussion on economic growth and education amid the coronavirus, and we're really thankful that you could be here today.
Well, thank you.
And I look forward to an enlightening discussion. You have quite a storied background. The 17th U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. You've been a presidential candidate for the highest office in the land. Yes. You're a notable neurosurgeon who seems to have surpassed many of your colleagues in your success. And you're an author of over 100 published articles and 6 books, one of which I read preparing for today, Gifted Hands. Yeah. I found it extremely useful and relevant to our discussion today on, at least on one question that we'll get to a little later, which is how can we help less advantaged and underprivileged kids succeed in America? And I think that's one of the big places where, if we're going to continue the economic growth record that has always propelled America kind of to the top of the world in terms of opportunity, that's going to be a question we have to answer. But we do face some notable headwinds in terms of we have unsustainable debts and fiscal policies that we have to deal with, and I'm not sure that all politicians are willing to. Mm-hmm. We have an aging and slowly growing population, which is also contributing to slower growth. We deal with issues that are related to globalization, rapid technological change, increasing income inequality, and increasing market power of some winner-take-all firms, which I think inhibit growth in the long run, or could inhibit growth in the long run if we don't pass policies that are consistent with that. So I guess I'd like to just start, though, with some simple questions before we get into some of that. But those will all be parts of our discussion today. And again, I'm just thrilled to be here with you. But just going back to pre-COVID, when the economy was really humming along and everything seemed to just be, even the lower end of the economic ladder was really making strong gains under the Trump administration. What were the priorities at HUD before COVID-19, and then how did they switch, or how did they change immediately after and into this period after COVID-19 has hit?
Well, I'm glad you point out the fact that the economy was extraordinarily strong, with unemployment numbers at record lows for African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, 71-year low for women. Even manufacturing was starting to come back, and the wealth gap was starting to close. And African Americans, the family income was up 7.9%. It was up about 5.5% for whites, so that was starting to close. Housing and the purchase of housing in the African American community went from 41.7 to 46.3%. Wow. Through the first quarter of 2020 from the last quarter of 2016. So, we were clicking on all cylinders. And the reason for that was not coincidence. It was the removal of so many restrictive regulations, mm-hmm. As well as some tax policies that were favorable to growth and to entrepreneurship, because our nation is full of entrepreneurs. It's full of innovative people. That's why America, went from a bunch of ragtag militiamen to the most powerful empire in the world in record time, and has remained the most powerful for some time now. It's because of those values and principles that we must never forget. However, even through all of that, we still had a significant problem with affordable housing, with homelessness, particularly in certain areas of the country. And there seemed to be a pretty strong correlation with some of the policies in those parts of the country that seemed to lead to increased homelessness. And we were making some pretty good progress, quite frankly, with the political class in those areas in terms of what we needed to do. And we put a lot of emphasis on deregulation. What had happened is, over the course of many years, things would come up and a new regulation would be advocated, but you wouldn't remove the old regulation, you just add it on. And it becomes very complex after a while. Instead of, from point A to point B being a straight line, it becomes a labyrinth. And each leg of that labyrinth costs money and costs time, and things are becoming extremely inefficient. So, we had a big focus on changing that whole equation, and we're making good progress with it, and with the homelessness situation in general. But after COVID came along, obviously it increased pressure. There are people who were worried about loss of income, losing their jobs, whether they would be able to stay in their home or stay in their apartment. Of course, we moved very rapidly with forbearance and a moratorium on foreclosures and evictions lasting through the end of this year. But it brings up a very important economic issue, and that is shutdown. Shutting down the economy. First of all, that our economy has been able to survive 6 months of shutdown says a lot about the strength of that economy. There's no question about that. But no economy can sustain this forever. And we have to begin to understand the lessons that have been learned about COVID-19 and how to control it, and utilize that knowledge to really be able to fully reopen our economy and get things moving again. We also have a lot of therapeutics that are in the pipeline, and we need to be perhaps a little more aggressive in terms of getting some of those things out to the public. I understand the whole concept of being careful and making sure that nothing is injurious and weighing the benefits and risk. But you can be too cautious. If I use the same degree of caution as a pediatric neurosurgeon, I would never operate on anybody. It would just be too dangerous. So you have to be able to weigh the benefits and the risk. When you look at the consequences of keeping people sheltered, the consequences of lack of interaction in the educational setting, and the detrimental effects, particularly to those in the lower socioeconomic groups that don't necessarily have access to high-speed internet or appropriate types of computers or tutors or what have you. And just getting 3 months behind is devastating. Getting 6 months or a year behind can have lifelong consequences. So, you have to sort of weigh those things as well when you're talking about benefits and risk, and just take a mature attitude toward how do we open and still live with this thing. One of the things that should be encouraging to us is influenza. Regular seasonal influenza is way down this year. Why? Because we're socially distancing, we're masking, we're washing our hands. We've learned a lot of things which are translatable to other areas in our lives. So I think that's the attitude that's going to need to be adopted going forward.
Yeah. That brings up a couple of questions. So one on the moratorium on forbearance, do you think we'll need to extend that possibly at the end of the year, or do you think it's more a case of if we just reopen more and we continue to have success,
Yeah, I think
we should be okay.
I think we have to accelerate our reopening. I do believe that some significant degree of anxiety will subside after the election. Unfortunately, we managed to inject politics into almost everything these days, and this is no exception. But I think we'll be able to move forward, and hopefully another stimulus package that makes sense will be gotten through. Keep in mind that it does not have to be one gigantic package. You can very specifically target, rental assistance or something like that without going into the multitudinous other things that people have tried to stack into the bill.
On the question of children and them being hit particularly hard by the shutdowns, what is your view on, when I look at it, I see, when we send our kids home and we don't allow them to go to school, we're really taking away a good chance. We're reducing their chances to succeed in the future.
Yes.
At the same time, we're borrowing a lot of money and we're putting it on their backs in the future as well. So it's kind of a double whammy.
No, you're exactly right about that. And, we need to be sensible. The mortality in the 0 to 19 age group for someone who contracts COVID-19 is incredibly small. The survival is 99.997%. So, it's incredibly unusual to have a bad outcome. So the response to that has been very disproportional to the detriment of the children. And then some people say, well, it's not so much the children we're concerned about, but some of the teachers are elderly and have comorbidities, and so these asymptomatic children may bring the disease to them. Well, the solution to that is not to shut everything down. The solution to that is to take those people who are very vulnerable and take them out of the school. Let them be the ones who do distal learning, distal teaching, not impose that upon the entire society of children. So again, most of the things that we're dealing with can be dealt with logic and common sense rather than hysteria.
So kind of moving a little bit away from COVID and just talking a general economic policy related to children and education. There are a lot of scholars that argue for reorganizing the way we fund schools and reallocating funds much earlier into the schooling process to hit kids between the ages of 3 and 6, so that we can, reach them at an earlier age, get development when their development processes are growing the most quickly, and also engender some socioeconomic skills in them, as well as train their parents. When we think about economic growth, or when I think about economic growth, and I look out in the world and see the faltering of our education system, especially among low-income and other disadvantaged kids, I see that as probably the single most important issue moving forward if we want to maintain a strong economy, 50 to 100 years from now.
Yeah,
what are the policies? What can we do there to be successful?
First of all, we need to recognize what you just said as truth, and it is true. Probably when I talk about homelessness, housing affordability, and a whole host of other social problems, almost all of those problems can be overcome by a strong education. You can be born in the worst ghetto or in the most remote and poverty-stricken farm in Appalachia, but if you get a good education, you basically write your own ticket. It's just one of the reasons that I'm a strong advocate, as is the president, of school choice. And don't leave people in failing schools. I remember some years ago with the No Child Left Behind program in Baltimore, there were a number of schools that completely failed. And the children were going to be sent to schools that were functioning well. And the politicians surrounded the school and they said, no, these are our schools and you're not messing with them. Well, what they're really doing is messing with the chances for those children to be successful. And that's where the argument needs to be turned. And the earlier we intervene and give them appropriate schooling, the better. Studies have shown us that if you have a child reading at grade level, by the third grade, it changes the trajectory of their lives. Their likelihood of dropping out decreases enormously at that point. And those are the kinds of things that we really need to be thinking about and focusing on financially. I think in terms of the way that we fund schools, we need to re-examine that as well, because we tend to fund schools, based on millage taxes in the areas where they live. Mm-hmm. So if they happen to live in a very poor area, there's not going to be a whole lot of money that's brought in, and so there's not going to be a lot of resources devoted to the schools that they attend. And of course, you kind of get what you pay for. So that perhaps is something that should be done on a statewide level as opposed to a community-wide level in order to make sure that we give all of the children the best chance to succeed.
Very good. I think I agree completely with everything you just said. What do you think about the future of higher education? We seem to have some issues there related to affordability. Mm-hmm. And again, I think that hits some of our lowest income citizens the hardest. What can we do to improve that phase of the education system?
Well, after every pandemic historically, there have been some very large societal changes and big moves. That may be coming to higher education. A lot of people are doing distal learning now. Some of the universities, like Liberty University, have really accelerated distance learning. Mm-hmm. And it seems to work. And one of the reasons that it is somewhat appealing to many people is we've reached a point where on many universities there's a level of intolerance to diversity of thinking that threatens, the whole learning atmosphere. And universities are supposed to be places where you go and you learn to discuss different philosophies and ideals and look at alternatives and develop a sense of who you are, as opposed to places where you're indoctrinated and told that there's only one way to think about things. So we really need to pay some very close attention to that, unless we want to create, down the road a society of zombies who all think the same way about everything and want to persecute anybody who doesn't think the same way that they do. But, this whole concept of distal learning is something that is really beginning to flourish at many levels. It's also beginning to have an impact on work. A lot of people have found that they can work just as effectively from home with the proper IT tools as they can at work. Plus they save the time driving back and forth to work. The thing that's actually going to enhance that is the fact that virtual reality systems are improving dramatically. We had a company come and demonstrate some of the technology at HUD a couple of years ago, where you could put the headgear on. And in this case, they were showing how you train people to be electricians. And so I put the headgear on, and all of a sudden I was in somebody's backyard. And you walk over to the fuse box and open it, and what you would find there, and it was all just as if I'm sitting there talking to you. the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., they have a virtual reality Israel tour. You put it on, and you're in Israel. There's the Garden of Gethsemane. There's the Sea of Galilee. People are walking by you. It's like you could reach out and touch them. As that kind of technology is accelerated, the classroom experience will be completely duplicable. Other types of experiences will too. Now, are there drawbacks? Of course there are. I don't know that anything can substitute for real social interaction. That will come close. But you know how difficult it is if you have teenage children to get them away from the PlayStation and these things now. Can you imagine if they can enter a virtual world? So it's going to require significant discipline. In some countries like South Korea, they've already invented certain types of software where the child can put on a wristband and it actually limits the amount of time that they can spend on the machine. We're going to have to be clever to make sure that technological advance does not come back to bite us.
That brings up kind of a point, I think. We talk a lot about the headwinds to growth, but there are some positives out there, and I think we've seen them through this process of dealing with the coronavirus, both in terms of people being allowed to work at home, which saves them time traveling back and forth to work. It's also likely good for the environment because we don't have as much carbon being emitted. And in addition, we've seen things like telemedicine explode, which I think this gets back to this idea of reducing regulations and really letting the market kind of determine the most effective ways.
Right.
What do you think about advances like that? Do they have?
I think we will adjust to them and we will use them to our advantage. Telemedicine obviously can reduce the cost very significantly. And, we're not just talking about you being able to sit down and talk, to the physician whose face is on the screen. We're talking about, an ophthalmoscope that a nurse practitioner or some other healthcare individual can actually hold up to the patient's eye, and then the doctor, from wherever they are, they can be halfway across the world, can look at the retina and see what's going on, or an otoscope, they can look at the tympanic membrane. And there are a number of other physical things that can be done by others, which can give the doctor immediate feedback. So they can also have access very quickly to, blood pressure and even some of the chemical components in the blood. Those things will make medicine much more accessible and a lot less expensive. Medicine is not as expensive as people think, but what do you need for good medicine? You need a patient and you need a healthcare provider. Along came the middleman to facilitate the relationship, and now the middleman is the principal dictating to both the patient and the physician and sucking most of the money out of the system. That doesn't make any sense. So we need to recalibrate that whole system so that you're dealing with the patient and with the healthcare provider. That's going to cut a lot of the cost out and also bring transparency into the system, because right now the hospitals and the clinics, they know they have to engage in a game with the insurance companies who only are going to pay them 20 cents on the dollar. So they say we better jack the price up 5 times what it should be so we can get reimbursed the right amount. And that's why when somebody, for instance, comes from overseas to have an operation done, and you look at their bill, it's about 1/5 of what the bill would be here, because you're not playing that game, you're just dealing directly with the cost. So we also need to make sure that we bring into medicine a system where the patient actually has skin in the game. The way it kind of works right now is sort of like you go to a hotel and you put your credit card down, and they give it back to you and say, oh, don't worry, all your expenses are taken care of. And then you're like, oh boy, wow, give me that room service menu and everything else. As before, you're saying, is there in the McDonald's nearby? So, you know, when you bring real responsibility into that system, that's going to control a lot of the cost as well. And, you know, there are systems, various types of health savings accounts and things of that nature which will allow us to do that. When you look at the amount of money that we spend right now, Medicaid, Medicare, it's enormous amounts of money because we have a system that really doesn't put restraints on how that money is utilized. And when we do begin to do that, we'll see that we're spending a lot less money and really getting much better and faster care.
And so that, it seems like this could help us at least in solving this problem of unsustainable fiscal policies that we face, in the sense that a lot of our debts are forward-looking debts that we're going to owe to people on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid.
Well, you said something very important. You talked about the double whammy that we're putting on the children, because they're the ones who are going to be responsible for this debt that we're accumulating. It's already the case that the service on the debt is about our third greatest annual expense now.
True.
It won't be long before it will be the biggest expense. Yeah. And the bigger it grows, the more of an impact it has on our children and our grandchildren, and what they will actually be able to take home from, you know, their labors. And that, of course, will have an impact on their enthusiasm for working. So, you know, there are consequences. You know, we go along in a happy-go-lucky way thinking, just another $2 trillion. That really has an impact on people who are coming along. We have to stop being selfish. You know, Thomas Jefferson said it's immoral to borrow from the next generation. What would he say if he could? He would just have a heart attack. He would die.
Yeah, he would be very upset because we're borrowing at substantial. I mean, $1 trillion. $1 trillion deficits is quite a rate of fiscal deficit. So President Trump recently released his Platinum Plan, designed to improve economic opportunities in black communities. And, you know, we're at a time in our country where, I mean, I think it's safe to say there's more division right now than we've had in quite some time.
Absolutely.
How can we heal and move back towards all being Americans and you know, kind of creating a slice of the pie from everyone? And does this plan do that? And can you tell us a little about it?
Well, the plan is helpful. Bear in mind that you know, the president has been labeled a racist breathlessly by many. Never mind the fact that when he was in New York, he got an award from Jesse Jackson because of all the economic opportunities he presented to the black community. Never mind that when he moved to Palm Beach, he was one of the people on the forefront of helping the clubs that were segregated to desegregate. As president, you know, the tremendous unprecedented support for HBCUs, you know, the prison reform, opportunity zones, all of these things are obviously extraordinarily helpful for the black community. So if he's a racist, he's the worst one ever. But, you know, when this Platinum Plan, you know, takes into consideration that a lot of the monies that had been set aside, you know, particularly during the CARES Act, didn't really get down to the level of, to the street level where it could really help people who were trying to start up businesses in some of these communities. So it takes that into consideration and ways of bringing money to the credit unions and the community development funds so that it actually gets to the people who need it and provides technical assistance because in many cases, they've not worked at that level before, either the lenders or the people who are doing the borrowing, to make sure that things are done in an appropriate and effective way so that you really get bang for your buck. And looking at educational issues and school choice issues, healthcare issues, there's a whole comprehensive set of things that are done in that Platinum Plan that I think will be very helpful to communities. And they're done with a long-range view, not just a short-range, I did this, vote for me type of view. And, I think these are things that I hope everybody can get behind. You don't have to be a Republican. You just have to be somebody who really wants to see the community succeed.
What do you think of the idea, we're going to step away a little bit, kind of broader picture, but what do you think of this idea of there are some companies in America that are just too large and too powerful? And could they be reducing economic growth and taking up too much of earning too much rent in the sense that they've this market power?
Certainly there is concern. When you look at America and you look at the jobs that are done here, at least 60% are small businesses. Mm-hmm. So if we continue to empower the gigantic companies that suck up all the air and the mom and pop shops all die, mm-hmm. There will be dire consequences for that. So this becomes a time when we really have to carefully analyze what's going on. Congress and the various agencies that deal with monopolies really need to sit down and do some long-range figuring about what are the implications of the things that are happening now, and how do we at least create a semi-level playing field so that American entrepreneurship and innovation can still thrive in our country. It's a real challenge.
I agree. You discussed homelessness and housing affordability. Another challenge I think we've been facing, which often isn't discussed, is this opioid epidemic. What can we do there?
Well, first of all, we need to recognize that when you're looking at the homeless population, the majority of them have either addiction issues or mental illness. Mm-hmm. And so when we're planning solutions for that, we have to take that into consideration. So when we do things like housing first, we just say, let's just take them and put them in a house and get them off the street. And that's a laudable goal. There's no question about that. It actually costs less to take them off the street than to leave them on the street. But you haven't completed the job with housing first. You also have to do housing second and housing third. Housing second, you figure out why they were on the street in the first place. And housing third, you remedy that. So if that means that they have mental illness, then you have to provide the kind of wraparound services that will provide counseling for them and medication for them, as well as a place where they can stay and not be concerned about their safety. So unless you do it in a holistic manner, you're kind of wasting your time. Mm. And the same goes for the community that's addicted. And we have increasing numbers because you have so many people who have bought into the concept of hopelessness, or somehow they want to enhance their lives, and that's how they get hooked on these drugs. And those who are not hooked have a tough time understanding it. You know, why do they do that? It's not that simple. And you know, once you get addicted, believe me, most people who are addicted, if there was a button they could push and they would not be addicted anymore, they would wear that button out. But it's just not that easy, and they're going to need help in order to get that. We have to be compassionate and provide the mechanism whereby that can take place. But we also have to realize what are the things that make people feel helpless and hopeless and thinking that they're in need of drugs. And we do have a lot of forces that are trying to convince people that they're victims and that somebody else is causing their woes, and that you need to be resentful of these people, and creating that guilt and that victimhood. It's a horrible thing. I remember, you know, seeing that when I was a kid growing up in inner city Detroit and Boston. Victimhood, the system's against you, you can't succeed, all of these people are prejudiced, the whole 9 yards constantly. Until my mother made us start reading books, and as I read about explorers and surgeons and scientists and entrepreneurs, I began to realize that the person who had the most to do with what happens to you is you. It's not somebody else. That doesn't mean that there aren't obstacles out there, but you get to determine how you're going to react to that obstacle. Is that going to be your excuse for failure? Or is that going to be a hurdle that you jump over and become strengthened for the next hurdle? So I tell people all the time, yes, there are problems. There's nobody who doesn't have problems. But success is determined by how you face those problems. And we have got to spend a little more time helping people to recognize how much individual power they have, and also empowering people to take control of their own lives.
So I think we've covered just a tremendous amount of ground. But I want to kind of end with I want to get a sense for your level of optimism or pessimism on going forward, both in terms of growth in the United States and you know, how we're going to do as a society educating our kids. Where do you stand? Where do you stand? What's your vision moving forward?
Well, you know, I've been to 68 countries, and I lived overseas. And the one thing that is so apparent to me is that this is by far the best place in the world to live, the place with the most potential. And when I was running for president, you know, I traveled to every nook and cranny of this country. And one thing that impressed me was that most of the people had common sense. And, you know, they weren't as easy to manipulate as you think they are. And that's what gives me courage and encourages me to believe that even though we're having some difficulties now, and even though there's a lot of divisiveness and hatred right now, I think it's something that we can overcome. I think the American spirit will prevail, and we will recognize that we're being manipulated, that we, the American people, are not each other's enemies, and that there is no external power, be it Russia, be it China, be it Iran, be it North Korea, that can destroy us. Only we can destroy us. And we are going to be smart enough to realize that and rectify what's going on.
Well, great. I just want to thank you again for joining us today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I find it very informative. I want to thank all of the viewers for joining us for this webinar, and I'm very honored to be here with you today, and I look forward to hearing you in the future. And so thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been a great honor and pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.